The poker table fell silent when Angeline's father slid her across the felt surface like she was nothing more than another ante. And every man in that Telluride saloon knew they were witnessing something that would stain their souls if they did nothing to stop it. The year was 1881, and the autumn wind howled through the mountain passes of Colorado, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of an early winter. But inside the Red Mountain Saloon, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the desperation of men who had gambled away their last shreds of decency. Angeline stood frozen near the bar, her worn calico dress doing little to protect her from the hungry stares of the men who surrounded her father's table, their eyes calculating her worth as if she were livestock at auction. She was 20 years old, with auburn hair that caught the lamplight like copper wire and green eyes that held more fire than fear. Though the fear was there too, buried deep beneath layers of survival instinct she had cultivated over the years of living with a man who loved whiskey more than his own flesh and blood. Her father, Thomas Anderson, had been a prospector once, back when the silver boom first drew thousands to these mountains. But the bottle had claimed him long before the mines dried up, and now he was little more than a shell of a man, his hands trembling as he pushed his daughter toward the center of the table where 3 bottles of premium Kentucky whiskey sat like golden trophies. "She's worth at least 3 bottles of the good stuff," Thomas slurred, his words barely coherent as he gestured wildly at Angeline. "Strong girl, can cook, can clean, and pretty enough to fetch a good price if you decide you don't want to keep her." The other gamblers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their gazes darting between the whiskey and the young woman whose fate hung in the balance. Most of them were miners or ranch hands, men who had seen hard times and harder winters, but even they recognized that some lines should never be crossed. Only one man at the table remained perfectly still, his weathered hands resting flat on the green felt, his gray eyes fixed not on the whiskey or on Angeline, but on her father with an expression that could have frozen the Arkansas River solid. Carter Adams was 30 years old, a cowboy who had drifted into Telluride 2 months earlier, trailing a herd of cattle from Wyoming. And something about these mountains had convinced him to stay through the changing seasons. He wore his dark hair longer than fashion dictated, and his face bore the scars of a life lived outdoors, including a thin white line that ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone, a souvenir from a longhorn's horn that had come too close during a stampede 5 years back. His reputation in town was solid but quiet. He worked hard, drank sparingly, and kept his business to himself, which in a place like Telluride was enough to earn respect without drawing unwanted attention. "I'll take the trade," Carter said quietly, his voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence like a blade through butter. The other men at the table exhaled in relief, grateful that someone was willing to resolve the situation, even if the resolution itself was morally questionable at best. Thomas Anderson's face split into a gap-toothed grin, and he reached across the table with shaking hands toward the 3 bottles of whiskey. His fingers had just closed around the first bottle when Carter's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist with enough force to make the older man yelp in pain. "I said I'll take the trade," Carter repeated, his voice still quiet but laced with steel. "But there's something I need to do first." Without releasing Thomas's wrist, Carter stood from his chair with a fluid grace that spoke of years in the saddle, his tall frame unfolding until he towered over the poker table. With his free hand, he picked up the first bottle of whiskey, uncorked it with his teeth, and then deliberately poured the entire contents onto the sawdust-covered floor. The amber liquid splashed and pooled, soaking into the wood and filling the air with the sharp scent of alcohol. Gasps erupted around the saloon, and Thomas Anderson struggled against Carter's grip, his eyes wild with a combination of fury and desperation as he watched the precious whiskey disappear. "What are you doing?" Thomas screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "That's mine. That's what she's worth." Carter released the man's wrist only long enough to grab the second bottle and pour it out as well, the whiskey joining the puddle at his feet. By the time he reached for the third bottle, Thomas was on his feet, swaying unsteadily, but before he could lunge forward, two of the other gamblers caught his arms and held him back. "No," Carter said firmly, uncorking the final bottle. "She's not worth 3 bottles of whiskey. She's not worth 100 bottles." He turned his gray eyes toward Angeline, who stood transfixed by the scene unfolding before her, her hands clutched together so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. "She's worth more than gold, and if you were any kind of man, you would have known that." The third bottle joined its brothers on the floor, and then Carter was moving around the table with purpose, his boots squelching slightly in the whiskey-soaked sawdust. He stopped in front of Angeline, and for the first time, she saw his expression soften, the hard edges smoothing into something that looked almost like gentleness. "I'm sorry you had to endure that, miss," he said quietly, pitching his voice low enough that only she could hear over her father's continued ranting. "I know this isn't much better, accepting that trade, but I give you my word as a man that I will never treat you as property or demand anything from you that you're not willing to give freely. If you want to leave this saloon and never see me again, I'll give you money for the stage to Denver. If you want to stay in Telluride, I'll help you find respectable work and a place to live. The choice is yours." Angeline studied his face for a long moment, searching for deception or ulterior motives, but all she found was a weary sincerity that seemed at odds with everything she knew about men. Her father had taught her that men were selfish creatures who took what they wanted without regard for consequences. The miners and gamblers she had encountered in Telluride had done nothing to contradict that lesson. But this cowboy, this Carter Adams, had just poured out 3 bottles of premium whiskey, not to make a point to her, but to make a point to her father. That kind of gesture spoke of principles, and principles were in short supply in mining towns. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mother died when I was 12, and I've been following him from camp to camp ever since. I can work, and I can earn my keep, but I won't be sold again. Not to you, not to anyone." "Agreed," Carter said immediately, and then he did something that surprised both of them. He extended his hand toward her as if she were a business partner rather than chattel he had just acquired. "My name is Carter Adams. I work at the bar Double a Ranch about 5 miles north of town. The foreman's wife needs help with the household and the cooking, and I'm sure I can convince her to take you on if you're interested." Angeline stared at his outstretched hand for several heartbeats before slowly placing her smaller hand in his. His grip was warm and calloused, the hand of someone who worked with rope and leather and wood, and when he shook her hand gently, she felt something unfamiliar flutter in her chest. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just the absence of fear, which in her experience amounted to nearly the same thing. "Angeline Anderson," she said, meeting his eyes. "And yes, I'm interested in honest work." Behind them, Thomas Anderson had finally broken free from the men restraining him, but instead of charging at Carter, he stumbled toward the bar, his focus already shifting to the possibility of convincing the bartender to extend him credit. Angeline watched her father with a mixture of pity and relief, knowing that this was likely the last time she would ever see him. The thought should have hurt more than it did, but she had used up all her tears for Thomas Anderson years ago, back when she still believed that love and family meant something. Carter guided her toward the saloon doors with a gentle hand at the small of her back, not pushing but simply indicating direction. As they passed through the entrance into the cold October night, Angeline drew her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and took a deep breath of mountain air that tasted of freedom. The stars overhead were brilliant in the thin altitude, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the moon. "My horse is at the livery," Carter said, gesturing down the muddy main street toward a low building with a painted sign. "It's too late to ride out to the ranch tonight, and I don't think it's appropriate for us to travel together without a chaperone anyway. There's a boarding house 2 blocks over run by a widow named Mrs. Fletcher. She's respectable and fair, and she'll give you a room for the night. Tomorrow morning, I'll arrange for us to ride out to the ranch with a proper escort." Angeline felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. A man who worried about propriety and chaperones was unlikely to have the darker intentions she had learned to fear. "I don't have money for a boarding house," she admitted quietly, shame coloring her cheeks despite the darkness. "I'll take care of it," Carter said simply. "Consider it part of the trade I made back there. Your father thought you were worth 3 bottles of whiskey, which means in his broken logic, I owe you at least that much value. Premium Kentucky whiskey runs about $2 a bottle, so that's $6 right there. A room at Mrs. Fletcher's is 50 cents a night. Seems to me I came out ahead on the deal." His matter-of-fact tone made it easier to accept the charity, and Angeline found herself nodding in agreement as they walked through the quiet streets of Telluride. The town was smaller than some of the mining camps she had lived in, but it had a more permanent feel, with actual wooden buildings instead of canvas tents, and boardwalks instead of muddy paths. The boom had come and was starting to fade, but enough ore remained in the mountains to keep the town viable, at least for now. Mrs. Fletcher turned out to be a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded Angeline of her mother. She took one look at Angeline's worn dress and pale face, and then fixed Carter with a stern expression that would have made a grizzly bear think twice about causing trouble. "This girl looks half-starved," Mrs. Fletcher declared, hands on her hips. "What kind of man brings a young woman to my door at this hour looking like she's been through a war?" "The kind who's trying to help, madam," Carter said respectfully, removing his hat. "She needs a safe place to stay tonight, and I'm willing to pay double your usual rate if you can provide her with a good meal and a locked door." Mrs. Fletcher's expression softened slightly, but her eyes remained sharp as they moved between Carter and Angeline, clearly trying to piece together the story. "This isn't that kind of establishment, Mr. Adams." "I know, madam," Carter assured her, "and that's exactly why I brought her here. Miss Anderson is going to be working at the Bar Double A Ranch starting tomorrow, and she just needs somewhere safe to spend the night." The boarding house owner studied them both for another moment before finally nodding. "All right then. Come on, dear. Let's get you fed and settled." She ushered Angeline inside with maternal efficiency, and before the door closed, Angeline looked back at Carter, who still stood on the porch with his hat in his hands. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "Get some rest," Carter replied. "I'll be back at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning with a wagon and a proper escort. We'll get you settled at the ranch." True to his word, Carter appeared at Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house the next morning driving a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 draft horses. Seated beside him was an older woman with steel-gray hair and a weathered face that broke into a warm smile when she saw Angeline step onto the porch. "This is Margaret Allen," Carter said, hopping down from the wagon with easy grace. "She's the foreman's wife I told you about last night." "Margaret, This is Miss Angeline Anderson." Margaret climbed down from the wagon despite Carter's offer to help and approached Angeline with an assessing but kind gaze. "Carter tells me you're looking for work and that you're not afraid of hard days." "That's right, madam," Angeline confirmed, straightening her spine despite her exhaustion. She had barely slept the night before, her mind too full of questions and fears about what the future might hold. "I've been keeping house for my father for 8 years, and before that, I helped my mother with everything from cooking to mending to tending the vegetable garden. I'm not afraid of work." Margaret nodded approvingly. "Good, because there's plenty of it at the ranch. My husband runs a crew of 15 cowboys, and while they're good men, they eat like locusts and make messes like children. I've been doing it alone for the past 2 years since my daughter got married and moved to Grand Junction, and I'll confess the work is getting harder as I get older. If you're willing to earn your keep, I'm willing to teach you anything you don't already know and provide you with room, board, and fair wages. $2 a week to start, with a raise to $3 after the first month if the arrangement works out." Angeline's breath caught in her throat. $2 a week was more money than she had ever seen at one time, let alone earned herself. "That's very generous, madam." "It's fair pay for fair work," Margaret corrected gently. "And please call me Margaret. We don't stand on ceremony much at the ranch." She glanced at Carter, who was loading Angeline's meager belongings into the back of the wagon. The entire sum of Angeline's worldly possessions fit into a single cloth bag that had seen better days. "Carter also tells me that your father won't be bothering you anymore." There was a question in the statement, and Angeline understood what the older woman was really asking. Would there be trouble? Would an angry father show up at the ranch making demands or causing scenes? "No, madam," Angeline said firmly. "My father traded me for whiskey last night in the Red Mountain Saloon. Carter here accepted the trade and then poured out all 3 bottles. As far as the law is concerned, and as far as my father is concerned, that transaction is complete. He has no further claim on me." Margaret's eyes widened, and she turned to look at Carter with an expression that mixed surprise and approval. "You poured out 3 bottles of premium whiskey," Carter shrugged, looking slightly uncomfortable with the attention. "It seemed like the thing to do at the time. No woman should be valued at 3 bottles of anything, no matter how expensive." "Well," Margaret said after a moment, "my opinion of you just went up several notches, Carter Adams, and it was already pretty high to begin with." She turned back to Angeline and reached out to squeeze her hand gently. "You'll be safe at the ranch, dear. My husband Jacob doesn't tolerate any nonsense from the men, and Carter here has a reputation as someone you don't cross unless you're looking for trouble. Between the 2 of them, and me with my cast iron skillet, you'll have all the protection you need." The ride out to the Bar Double, a ranch, took just over an hour, following a well-worn road that climbed into the foothills of the San Juan Mountains. The autumn colors were spectacular, with aspens turning gold and scrub oak flaming red against the dark green of the pine forests. Snow already dusted the highest peaks, glittering in the morning sunlight, and the air was so clear and cold that Angeline felt like she could see forever. Carter drove the wagon with steady competence, occasionally pointing out landmarks or explaining the geography, while Margaret kept up a comfortable stream of conversation that required little response, as if she understood that Angeline needed time to process everything that had happened in the past 12 hours. The ranch itself was nestled in a broad valley where a creek ran year-round, fed by snowmelt from the mountains. The main house was a solid 2-story structure built from logs and chinked with white mortar, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Behind it stood a large barn, several corrals, a bunkhouse for the cowboys, and various outbuildings for equipment and supplies. Cattle dotted the valley floor, fat and healthy-looking, and Angeline could see several men on horseback moving among the herd in the distance. "Home, sweet home," Margaret announced as Carter pulled the wagon up in front of the main house. "It's not fancy, but it's sturdy and warm, and we've got one of the best water sources in the county." Jacob's father homesteaded this land back in 1865, right after the war ended, and we've been building it up ever since. Jacob Allen turned out to be a tall, lean man in his 50s with sun-weathered skin and eyes that missed nothing. He emerged from the barn as they were unloading Angeline's bag, wiping his hands on a rag and studying the newcomer with the same assessing gaze his wife had used earlier. "This is the young woman Carter told us about?" Jacob asked, his voice a deep rumble. "This is Angeline Anderson," Margaret confirmed. "She's going to be helping me with the household, and I expect you to make it clear to the boys that she's off limits for anything but respectful greetings." Jacob nodded slowly. "I'll have a talk with the crew tonight. Any man who causes trouble will be looking for work elsewhere." He turned his attention to Angeline, and his stern expression softened slightly. "Welcome to the bar, AA, Miss Anderson. We're glad to have you." The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity that left Angeline falling into bed exhausted every night. But it was a good exhaustion, the kind that came from honest work rather than the soul-crushing weariness of living with her father's unpredictable rages. Margaret was true to her word, teaching Angeline everything from how to cook for a crew of hungry cowboys to the best techniques for keeping the wood stove burning at the right temperature for baking bread. The work was hard, starting before dawn and often continuing until after dark, but there was a rhythm and purpose to it that Angeline had never experienced before. The cowboys kept their distance at first, tipping their hats politely when they encountered her, but otherwise giving her a wide berth. Angeline suspected that Jacob had indeed had a very clear conversation with his crew, and she was grateful for it. The last thing she needed was unwanted attention or advances from men who might see her as available simply because of her circumstances. Carter, however, was a different story. He lived in the bunkhouse with the other cowboys, but his work often brought him to the main house, whether he was helping Margaret carry water for laundry or repairing a broken porch step that Jacob had been meaning to fix for weeks. At first, Angeline assumed he was just being helpful in general, but as the days turned into weeks, she began to notice that Carter always seemed to find reasons to be wherever she was working. He never said anything inappropriate or made her uncomfortable. Instead, he would strike up casual conversations while mending a fence panel or checking on the horses in the corral near where she was hanging laundry. He asked about her day, listened to her answers with genuine interest, and shared stories about his own life that gradually painted a picture of a man who had seen hard times but refused to let them make him hard. Carter had been born in Missouri. He told her one afternoon while helping her harvest the last of the vegetables from Margaret's garden before the first hard freeze. His parents had died of cholera when he was 14, and he had made his way west working odd jobs and learning the cowboy trade from men who were willing to teach a determined kid with no family and fewer prospects. He had worked ranches in Kansas, Texas, and Wyoming before drifting into Colorado, and somewhere along the way, he had developed a code of honor that seemed old-fashioned even in 1881. "My father used to say that a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns or how much money he makes," Carter said, carefully pulling carrots from the dark soil and shaking off the dirt. "It's measured by how he treats people who can't do anything for him in return. I try to live by that, though I don't always succeed." Angeline, who was gathering the carrots into a basket, paused to look at him. The afternoon sun caught the silver threads in his dark hair and highlighted the lines around his eyes, lines that came from squinting into the sun and wind rather than age. He was handsome in a rough, weathered way, but it was his character that drew her attention more than his appearance. "You succeeded with me," she said quietly. "You could have walked away from that poker table and let someone else deal with the situation, but you didn't. And then you gave me choices instead of demands. That takes a better man than most." Carter's hands stilled in the dirt, and when he looked up at her, his gray eyes held an intensity that made her breath catch. "You deserved better than what was happening to you. Any decent person would have done the same." "But they didn't," Angeline pointed out. "There were 5 other men at that table, and a whole saloon full of witnesses, and you were the only one who did anything." They held each other's gaze for a long moment, and Angeline felt something shift between them, like a door opening onto a room she had never known existed. The possibility of connection, of genuine affection, of something more than just survival. The feeling was both terrifying and exhilarating, and she found herself looking away first, flustered in a way she had never experienced before. The first snow came in mid-November, a light dusting that turned the world white overnight and made everything seem clean and new. Angeline stood on the porch of the main house watching the sun rise over the snow-covered mountains, a cup of hot coffee warming her hands, and realized with a start that she was happy. Not just content or resigned to her circumstances, but genuinely happy. She had meaningful work, a safe place to sleep, enough food to eat, and people around her who treated her with respect and kindness. After years of uncertainty and fear, she had found something that felt almost like home. "Beautiful morning," Carter's voice said from behind her, and she turned to find him climbing the porch steps, his breath visible in the cold air. Snow dusted his hat and the shoulders of his heavy coat, and his cheeks were red from the cold. "I've been checking on the cattle in the north pasture. They're all clustered together for warmth, but they seem to be doing fine. Would you like some coffee?" Angeline offered, gesturing to the pot she had left on the porch railing. "It's still hot." "That would be wonderful," Carter admitted, accepting the cup she poured for him. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and even through their gloves, Angeline felt that same spark of connection she had experienced in the garden. "How are you settling in? You've been here almost 6 weeks now." "I love it here," Angeline said honestly. "Margaret is wonderful to work with, and Jacob treats me like I'm actually valuable rather than just another mouth to feed. The work is hard, but it's good work, the kind that makes you feel accomplished at the end of the day." Carter smiled, and the expression transformed his usually serious face into something warm and approachable. "I'm glad. I've been meaning to tell you. There's a church social in town next Saturday. Nothing fancy, just people gathering to share food and music before the winter really sets in. Margaret and Jacob usually go, and I was wondering if you might like to come along. It would be a good chance for you to meet some of the other women in the area, make some friends." The invitation was casual, but Angeline sensed an undercurrent of something more beneath his words. "Will you be going?" "I was planning on it," Carter said, his gray eyes fixed on hers. "And I was hoping that maybe you would let me escort you, if that's something you might be interested in." Angeline's heart began to beat faster. This was more than just an invitation to a church social. This was Carter asking permission to court her, to move their relationship from friendly acquaintances to something more intentional. The sensible part of her brain counseled caution. She had only known him for 6 weeks, and her experience with men had not been positive. But her heart, which had been locked away for so long, was urging her to take the risk. "I would like that very much," she said, and watched as Carter's smile widened into something that looked like pure joy. The church social was held in the town's small schoolhouse, which doubled as a community gathering space when school was not in session. By the time Carter, Angeline, Margaret, and Jacob arrived in the ranch wagon, the building was already packed with people, and the smell of home-cooked food filled the air. Long tables had been set up along one wall, groaning under the weight of pies, casseroles, roasted meats, and fresh bread. In one corner, 3 men with fiddles were tuning their instruments, preparing to provide music for dancing later in the evening. Angeline felt nervous as they entered, conscious of the curious stares that followed her progress through the room. Telluride was a small town, and everyone had heard some version of the story about the girl who had been traded for whiskey and the cowboy who had poured it out. She kept her head high, and her hand resting lightly on Carter's offered arm, drawing strength from his steady presence beside her. Margaret proved to be a social butterfly, introducing Angeline to what seemed like every woman in the county, from the young wives of miners to the older widows who formed the backbone of the church community. Most were kind, offering genuine welcome and expressing interest in getting to know her better. A few were standoffish, their disapproval clear in their tight smiles and brief greetings, but Angeline had expected that. Respectable society had rigid rules about propriety, and a woman who had been gambled away in a saloon, even through no fault of her own, would always carry a certain stain. Carter never left her side, his presence a silent declaration that anyone who wanted to judge Angeline would have to answer to him. When the music started, and couples began to move toward the center of the room for dancing, he turned to her with a slightly nervous expression. "I should warn you that I'm not much of a dancer," he admitted. "I can manage a simple waltz without stepping on too many toes, but anything more complicated than that is beyond my abilities." Angeline laughed, the sound surprising her with its lightness. "That makes 2 of us. My mother tried to teach me when I was younger, but we never had much occasion to practice." "Then we'll muddle through together," Carter said, extending his hand with a small bow that was only slightly mocking. "May I have this dance, Miss Anderson?" "You may, Mr. Adams," Angeline replied, placing her hand in his and letting him lead her onto the makeshift dance floor. The first few steps were awkward, both of them concentrating on not tripping over each other's feet, but gradually they found a rhythm that worked. Carter was a better dancer than he had claimed, or perhaps he was just good at adapting to his partner's abilities. He held her at a respectful distance, one hand at her waist and the other clasping hers, and moved them around the floor with a confidence that suggested he had danced more often than he admitted. "You're better at this than you said," Angeline observed, looking up at him with amusement. Carter had the grace to look sheepish. "I might have downplayed my abilities slightly. I figured if you thought I was terrible, you would be more willing to dance with me out of pity." "That's devious," Angeline said, but she was smiling. "What other hidden talents are you keeping secret?" "Well, I can play the harmonica, though not particularly well. I can read and write, which surprises some people. And I make a decent pot of coffee over a campfire, though nothing compared to what you brew every morning." He paused, and then added more quietly, "And I'm falling in love with you, though I'm trying to be patient and not rush you into anything you're not ready for." Angeline stumbled, and only Carter's quick reflexes kept her from falling. They had stopped dancing, standing still in the middle of the moving couples, and she stared up at him with wide eyes. "You're what?" she whispered, not sure she had heard him correctly over the music and conversation. "Falling in love with you," Carter repeated, his gray eyes serious and intent. "I know it's fast, and I know you have every reason to be cautious about men and their intentions. but I've never been good at lying or pretending, so I figured I should be honest about my feelings. You don't have to say anything back. You don't have to feel the same way. I just wanted you to know where I stand so that if and when you're ready to think about a future with someone, you'll know that I'm interested in being that someone." Angeline's mind was racing, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. This was everything she had been afraid to hope for, wrapped up in a declaration so honest and straightforward that it cut through all her defenses like a knife through butter. Carter wasn't making demands or trying to manipulate her. He was simply laying his cards on the table and letting her decide what to do with the information. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice shaking slightly. "No one has ever said anything like that to me before." "Then don't say anything yet," Carter suggested gently. He carefully moved them back into the dance, his movements smooth and steady, giving her something to focus on besides the chaos of her emotions. "Take your time and think about it. I'm not going anywhere and there's no rush. I just wanted you to know that I see you, Angeline. Not as property, not as someone I rescued, but as a woman who's smart and strong and beautiful, and who deserves to be loved for exactly who she is." They danced for the rest of the evening, and though they spoke of other things, lighter topics that didn't require the vulnerability Carter had just displayed, his words echoed in Angeline's mind like a song she couldn't quite forget. When they finally returned to the ranch late that night, she lay in her small bedroom in the main house and stared at the ceiling, trying to sort through the tangle of feelings in her chest. Fear was there, certainly. Fear of being hurt, fear of making a mistake, fear of trusting someone who might turn out to be as flawed and dangerous as her father. But underneath, the fear was something else, something that felt warm and bright and full of possibility. Hope. And beneath the hope was the growing realization that Carter's feelings might not be entirely one-sided. She looked forward to seeing him every day. She found excuses to be where he was working. She had memorized the exact shade of gray in his eyes and the way his smile started slowly before spreading across his entire face. She was falling in love too, she realized with a mixture of terror and joy. After years of learning to survive, she was finally learning how to live. The winter deepened, bringing more snow and temperatures that dropped below zero on the coldest nights. The work at the ranch shifted to accommodate the season. The cattle were moved to lower pastures where feed was more accessible, and the cowboys spent their days breaking ice on water troughs and distributing hay. Inside the main house, Angeline and Margaret focused on preserving food, mending clothes and tack, and keeping the fires burning warm and steady. Carter found more reasons than ever to be near Angeline, and she stopped pretending she didn't notice or didn't welcome his presence. They fell into an easy companionship that deepened with each passing day. He taught her how to curry a horse properly, standing close behind her to guide her hands through the long, smooth strokes that the animals loved. She taught him how to make her mother's recipe for apple cobbler, laughing when he got flour on his nose and everything else within reach. They took walks along the creek when the weather permitted, their breath visible in the cold air as they talked about everything and nothing, building the foundation of understanding that real love required. On Christmas Eve, Jacob and Margaret hosted a dinner for the entire crew, turning the main house into a warm, festive gathering place. Margaret had cooked for days, and the table was laden with roasted turkey, potatoes, vegetables from the root cellar, fresh bread, and 3 different kinds of pie. The cowboys, cleaned up and on their best behavior, filled the house with laughter and storytelling. And for a few hours, everyone forgot about the harsh realities of winter and work and simply enjoyed being together. After dinner, As the men settled in the parlor with pipes and conversation, Angeline slipped outside onto the porch to get some air. The night was clear and cold, the sky so full of stars it looked like someone had scattered diamonds across black velvet. She was wrapped in her warmest shawl, but the cold still bit through the fabric, making her shiver. "You'll freeze out here," Carter's voice said, and then he was beside her, draping his heavy coat over her shoulders. The wool smelled like him, a combination of leather and horses and something uniquely masculine that made her feel safe. "Thank you," she said, pulling the coat tighter. "I just needed a moment of quiet. It's wonderful having everyone together, but it's also overwhelming." "I understand," Carter said, leaning against the porch railing beside her. "I'm not much for crowds either." He was quiet for a moment and then added, "I got you something for Christmas. Nothing fancy, but I wanted you to have it." He pulled a small package from his pocket, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Angeline took it with trembling fingers, touched by the gesture. She carefully unwrapped the paper to reveal a small wooden box, smooth and polished to a warm glow. When she opened it, she found a delicate silver necklace with a small pendant in the shape of a heart. "It was my mother's," Carter explained quietly. "One of the few things of hers that I kept after she died. I've been carrying it with me for 16 years, waiting for the right person to give it to. I can't think of anyone more deserving than you." Angeline's eyes filled with tears, overwhelmed by the significance of the gift. This wasn't just a piece of jewelry. This was Carter offering her a piece of his history, his heart, his future. "Carter, I can't accept this. It's too precious, too important to you." "Which is exactly why I want you to have it," Carter said firmly. He took the necklace from the box and moved behind her, carefully fastening it around her neck. His fingers were gentle against her skin, and she shivered for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. When he was finished, he turned her around to face him, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. "I meant what I said at the church social. I'm in love with you, Angeline. I want to build a life with you if that's something you want too." Angeline reached up to touch the pendant at her throat, feeling the weight of it against her skin. This was the moment of decision, the point where she either stepped forward into the unknown or retreated back into the safety of solitude. Her father had taught her that love was dangerous, that trusting someone was foolish, that the only person you could really count on was yourself. But Carter had spent the past 3 months proving that everything her father believed was wrong. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I've been afraid to admit it, even to myself, but I do. I love you, Carter Adams." The smile that spread across Carter's face was brighter than all the stars overhead. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close but carefully, as if she were something precious that might break. Angeline wrapped her arms around his waist and let herself relax into his embrace, feeling safe and wanted and valued in a way she had never experienced before. "Will you marry me?" Carter asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't have much to offer you besides hard work and honest affection, but I promise I will spend every day of my life making sure you know you're worth more than gold, more than anything. You'll never have to worry about being traded or sold or treated as anything less than the remarkable woman you are." Angeline pulled back just enough to look up into his face, seeing the hope and vulnerability there. This man, who was strong enough to face down stampeding cattle and harsh winters and desperate gamblers, was nervous about her answer. The realization made her love him even more. "Yes," she said clearly, wanting there to be no doubt. "Yes, I'll marry you." Carter let out a whoop of joy that brought several cowboys tumbling out onto the porch to see what the commotion was about. When they saw Carter and Angeline wrapped in each other's arms, understanding dawned. And soon the entire household was crowded onto the porch, offering congratulations and well wishes. Margaret cried happy tears and pulled Angeline into a fierce hug, while Jacob shook Carter's hand with a grip that made the younger man wince. They were married in late January, in the same schoolhouse where they had danced together for the first time. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, with Angeline wearing a new dress that Margaret had helped her sew from fabric Carter had purchased in town. It was a soft blue that brought out the green in her eyes, with delicate white lace at the collar and cuffs. Carter wore his best suit, his hair trimmed and his face cleanly shaved, and when Angeline walked down the makeshift aisle toward him, she saw his eyes shine with unshed tears. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but when Carter promised to love and cherish her, Angeline heard the echo of that night in the saloon when he had poured out 3 bottles of whiskey and declared her worth more than gold. And when she promised to love and honor him, she meant it with every fiber of her being, knowing that this man had given her back not just her freedom but her belief in the possibility of goodness. Jacob Allen, acting as a witness, presented them with a wedding gift that left both of them speechless. He had decided to retire from active ranch management, he explained, and wanted to subdivide the bar double a property. Carter would become the new foreman, with a significant increase in salary and the opportunity to eventually purchase a portion of the land for his own ranch. It was the kind of opportunity that cowboys dreamed about but rarely achieved, a chance to move from hired hand to landowner, from wanderer to someone with roots. They spent their wedding night in a small cabin on the ranch property that had previously been used for storage. The crew had spent the past week cleaning it out, making repairs, and even building a proper bed frame. Margaret had contributed a beautiful quilt, and several of the other ranch families had donated furniture, dishes, and other household items. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, a space that belonged only to them where they could begin building their life together. Angeline stood in the doorway of the cabin as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Carter came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on the top of her head. "What are you thinking about?" he asked quietly. "How different my life is from what I expected," Angeline admitted. 6 months ago, I thought I would spend the rest of my life following my father from one disaster to another, always hungry, always afraid, always alone. And now I have this. I have you. I have a home. I have a future that actually looks bright instead of terrifying. Carter tightened his embrace. "You have me for as long as you want me, which I'm hoping will be forever. And that future we're going to build together. It's going to be even brighter than you can imagine." The first year of marriage brought challenges and joys in equal measure. The work of running a ranch was endless, with cattle to tend, fences to mend, equipment to maintain, and 1,000 other tasks that filled every daylight hour. But Angeline discovered that hard work was easier when you were building something that belonged to you, and the exhaustion at the end of the day was tempered by the comfort of falling asleep in Carter's arms. They developed routines and rhythms, learning each other's strengths and weaknesses, figuring out how to navigate disagreements without letting them fester into real conflicts. Carter could be stubborn when he thought he was right, and Angeline had a tendency to keep her worries to herself rather than burden others with them. But they both made conscious efforts to communicate, to be honest even when honesty was uncomfortable, to remember that they were partners working toward common goals rather than adversaries fighting for control. In the spring, Angeline planted a vegetable garden near the cabin, working the soil until her hands were stained with dirt and her back ached from bending over. Carter built her a small greenhouse, using scavenged lumber and old windows, creating a space where she could start seedlings early and extend the growing season into late fall. Together, they raised chickens for eggs and meat, and Angeline learned how to preserve food for the winter, canning vegetables and making jams from wild berries they picked in the mountains. The community that had been cautiously welcoming at first gradually accepted them fully, as it became clear that Carter and Angeline were serious about building a life in Telluride. They attended church regularly, participated in community events, and helped neighbors when help was needed. Slowly but surely, the whispers about Angeline's past faded, replaced by recognition of her character and contributions. In August, Angeline realized that her monthly courses were late, and a flutter of excitement mixed with nervousness settled in her stomach. She waited another 2 weeks to be sure before telling Carter, choosing a quiet evening when they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. "I think I'm pregnant," she said without preamble, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Carter, who had been whittling a piece of wood, froze mid-motion. He set down the knife and wood very carefully and turned to look at her, his gray eyes wide with surprise and dawning joy. "You think, or you're certain?" "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor," Angeline clarified. "My courses are 3 weeks late, and I've been feeling sick in the mornings. Margaret says those are pretty clear signs." Carter let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob, and pulled Angeline into his arms. "We're going to have a baby," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "A baby, our baby." "Are you happy?" Angeline asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Carter assured her, pulling back to frame her face with his hands. "I'm terrified and excited and grateful and about 100 other emotions all at once. But yes, above everything else, I'm happy. We're going to be parents, Angeline. We're going to build a family." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall and into the winter. Angeline continued working as long as she was able, though Margaret and Carter both fussed over her to the point of annoyance, insisting she rest more and lift less. By January, when the baby's movements were strong and frequent, Angeline had to admit that slowing down was necessary. Her belly had grown round and large, and simple tasks like bending over to put on her shoes had become complicated endeavors. Carter was simultaneously the most attentive and most nervous, expectant father imaginable. He read every book about childbirth and child-rearing that he could get his hands on, pestering the doctor in town with questions until the poor man started avoiding him. He built a beautiful cradle from cherry wood, sanding it until it was smooth as silk and carving their initials into the headboard. And every night, he would rest his hand on Angeline's belly and talk to their unborn child, telling stories about the ranch and the mountains and the family they would be. The baby arrived in early March, 2 weeks before the expected date, on a night when a late winter storm howled around the cabin. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours, and there were moments when fear threatened to overwhelm both of them. But Margaret was there, having delivered dozens of babies over the years, and she guided Angeline through each contraction with calm authority. Carter stayed by his wife's side the entire time, letting her squeeze his hand until the bones ached, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, and murmuring encouragement when her strength seemed to fail. When the baby finally emerged in the early hours of the morning, the storm had passed, and the first light of dawn was painting the sky pink. The child's cry was strong and indignant, and Margaret laughed as she quickly cleaned and wrapped the infant before placing it in Angeline's exhausted arms. "You have a son," Margaret announced, her face beaming with pride as if she had accomplished the birth herself. "A big, healthy boy with an excellent set of lungs." Angeline looked down at the tiny face of her son, taking in his dark hair, and the way his small fist waved in the air as if protesting his sudden arrival into the cold world. She felt a surge of love so powerful it actually hurt, a fierce protective instinct that she knew would last for the rest of her life. This was her child, hers and Carter's, a living symbol of everything good that had come from the worst night of her life. Carter was crying openly, tears streaming down his face as he carefully touched his son's tiny hand with one finger. The baby immediately grasped it, his grip surprisingly strong, and Carter made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Hello there," he whispered to the baby. "I'm your father, and I promise you that I will do everything in my power to make sure you know you're loved and valued every single day of your life. You're worth more than gold, little one. You're worth everything." They named him Thomas Jacob Adams, honoring both Carter's father and the man who had given them their start at the Bar Double Ranch. From the beginning, Tommy was a sweet-tempered baby who seemed content as long as he was warm, fed, and held. He had Carter's gray eyes and Angeline's auburn hair, and as he grew, his personality emerged as a perfect blend of both parents, serious and observant like his father but with his mother's quick smile and determination. The years that followed were the happiest of Angeline's life. Carter proved to be an exceptional ranch foreman, increasing the Bar Double A's productivity and reputation, while treating the cowboys under his command with respect and fairness. He saved carefully, and after 5 years, he and Angeline purchased 200 acres of land adjacent to the main ranch, beginning the process of building their own operation. It was slow, hard work, but they approached it as a team, making decisions together and supporting each other through setbacks and successes alike. Tommy was joined by 2 more children, a daughter they named Sarah Margaret when he was 3, and another son they called Henry Carter 2 years after that. The cabin that had seemed spacious for a newly married couple became cramped with 3 children, so Carter spent 2 summers building a proper house, a 2-story structure with enough bedrooms for their growing family, and a large kitchen where Angeline could cook and bake to her heart's content. The children grew up surrounded by love and hard work, learning from an early age that success came from dedication, and that family was the most important thing in the world. Tommy inherited his father's affinity for animals and became an excellent horseman. Sarah developed her mother's green thumb and spent hours in the garden, experimenting with different plants and techniques. Henry, the youngest, was the dreamer of the family, always asking questions about the world beyond their valley and talking about the places he wanted to see someday. Through it all, Carter and Angeline's love deepened and matured. The passionate intensity of early romance evolved into something richer and more complex, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared experiences, and unwavering commitment. They had their arguments, of course. Carter's stubbornness occasionally clashed with Angeline's tendency to take on too much without asking for help. But they had learned how to fight fair, how to listen even when they disagreed, and how to remember that they were on the same side even when it didn't feel like it in the heat of the moment. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Carter took Angeline back to Telluride for a rare night away from the children and the ranch. They had dinner at the hotel restaurant, a luxury they rarely indulged in, and then walked the streets of the town that had witnessed both the worst and best moments of Angeline's life. The Red Mountain Saloon was still standing, though under different ownership now. Angeline paused in front of it, looking at the swinging doors and remembering the girl she had been 10 years earlier, frightened and alone, being traded like an object by the man who should have protected her. "You ever regret it?" she asked Carter quietly. taking that trade. You could have just walked away, let someone else deal with the situation. Carter wrapped his arm around her waist and pulled her close. I've never regretted it for even a single second. That night in the saloon wasn't just about saving you, though God knows that was important enough on its own. It was about me finally understanding what really matters in life. I had been drifting for years, going from job to job, town to town, never putting down roots because I was afraid of getting hurt or disappointed. And then I saw you standing there, and something inside me just clicked into place. I knew that if I walked away, I would regret it for the rest of my life. So I made the trade, poured out the whiskey, and hoped that somehow, someway we might find our way to each other. And we did. Angeline turned in his arms to face him fully, reaching up to touch his face. There was gray in his hair now, and lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a decade ago. But he was still the most handsome man she had ever seen. More importantly, he was still the best man she had ever known, someone whose actions consistently matched his words, whose love was demonstrated through 1,000 small kindnesses rather than grand gestures. "I love you," she said simply. "Thank you for seeing my worth when I couldn't see it myself. Thank you for giving me a life I never dreamed was possible." Carter kissed her softly, right there on the street where anyone could see, and Angeline kissed him back without hesitation. They weren't the scared young people who had met in a saloon anymore. They were partners, parents, landowners, respected members of the community. But more than any of those things, they were two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the wreckage of a bad situation. As they walked back to the hotel hand in hand, Angeline thought about the title Carter had inadvertently given her that night 10 years ago. Worth more than gold. At the time, she hadn't believed it. How could she, when her own father had valued her at 3 bottles of whiskey? But Carter had poured out those bottles and, in doing so, had poured out all her doubts and fears and self-hatred. He had given her the space and support to discover her own worth, to recognize that she was capable and strong and deserving of love. The ranch continued to prosper over the following years. What had started as 200 acres grew to 500, then 800, then 1,000. The Adams brand became known throughout Colorado for quality cattle and fair dealing. Tommy took on more responsibilities as he grew into young adulthood, showing every sign of becoming as skilled a rancher as his father. Sarah got married to a young man from a neighboring ranch, a quiet, hard-working fellow who clearly adored her and treated her with the respect she deserved. Henry eventually left for Denver to study engineering, fulfilling his dream of seeing more of the world, though he promised to return regularly and never forgot his roots. Carter and Angeline grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard work. But their love never faded. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year, tempered by shared experiences and deepened by mutual understanding. They developed the comfortable companionship of long married couples, often able to communicate with just a look or a gesture, finishing each other's sentences and anticipating each other's needs without conscious thought. On the evening of their 25th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a celebration. The house that Carter had built was filled to bursting with family, and the sound of laughter and conversation echoed off the walls. After dinner, as the sun set behind the mountains they both loved, Carter led Angeline outside to the porch, seeking a moment of quiet away from the happy chaos. 25 years, Angeline marveled, leaning against the porch railing and looking out over the land they had built together. Sometimes it feels like we just got married yesterday, and other times it feels like we've been together forever. Best 25 years of my life, Carter said, moving to stand behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. You know, I've been thinking a lot lately about that night in the saloon. Oh, Angeline prompted, curious about where this was going. Your father thought 3 bottles of whiskey was a fair trade for you, Carter continued quietly. And I poured those bottles out and told him you were worth more than gold, but I was wrong. Angeline stiffened slightly, surprise and a hint of old hurt making her tense in his arms. Wrong? Yeah, Carter said, his voice warm with affection. You're not worth more than gold. You're priceless. There's no amount of money or property or anything else in this world that could match your value. You've given me a family, a home, a purpose, and more love than any man deserves. So I wanted to set the record straight after all these years. You're not worth more than gold. You're worth everything. Angeline turned in his arms, her eyes bright with unshed tears. After 25 years of marriage, 3 children, countless challenges overcome, and more blessings than she could count, this man could still surprise her with the depth of his love. And you, she said, reaching up to cup his weathered face in her hands, are the best thing that ever happened to me. You gave me back my life, Carter. You showed me what love really looks like. You proved that goodness exists in this world, even in the darkest places. I was traded for whiskey. You poured it out, and in doing so, you poured a foundation for everything good that came after. I will never stop being grateful for that night, and I will never stop loving you. They kissed as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, surrounded by the land they had worked together, the family they had created, and the life they had built from nothing more than courage, determination, and love. Inside the house, their children and grandchildren were celebrating, creating new memories that would become part of the family story passed down through generations. The story of how Angeline was traded for whiskey and Carter poured it out became a legend in the family, told and retold with various embellishments and interpretations. But the core message never changed. People are not property. Love is demonstrated through actions, not words. And sometimes the worst moments in our lives lead directly to the best ones, if we're brave enough to take the chances presented to us. As they grew even older, Carter and Angeline slowly handed over the day-to-day operations of the ranch to Tommy and his wife. They built a small cottage near the main house where they could live comfortably while still being close to family. Their days became quieter, filled with simple pleasures like tending the garden, reading together in the evening, and watching their grandchildren play in the yard. On a warm summer evening in 1906, 25 years after that fateful night in the Red Mountain Saloon, they sat together on the porch of their cottage, holding hands and watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and red. They were both in their 60s now, their bodies slowed by age but their minds still sharp, their love still strong. "You remember what you said to me that first night?" Angeline asked, her voice soft in the gathering twilight. "After you poured out the whiskey." "I said a lot of things that night," Carter replied, squeezing her hand gently. "Which part are you thinking about?" "You told me I had choices," Angeline said. "You offered to give me money for the stage to Denver or to help me find work and a place to live. You gave me power over my own life when everyone else, including me, thought I had none. That was the moment I started to fall in love with you, even though I was too scared to recognize it at the time." Carter was quiet for a moment, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "You know what I remember most clearly? The look in your eyes when you shook my hand. You were terrified, but you were trying so hard to be brave, to hold onto your dignity in a situation designed to strip it away. I saw your strength that night, Angeline, even when you couldn't see it yourself." and I knew that anyone with that much courage deserved a chance at something better. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss on Christmas Eve so many years ago. Around them, the ranch hummed with the quiet sounds of evening, cattle settling for the night, horses moving in the corrals, the distant laughter of grandchildren being called inside for bed. "Worth more than gold," Angeline murmured, touching the silver pendant at her throat, Carter's mother's necklace that she had worn every day for the past 25 years. "You gave me that worth, Carter. You poured out those bottles of whiskey and you poured out a new life for me, for us." "We gave each other a new life," Carter corrected gently. "I was drifting before I met you, lost in ways I didn't even understand. You gave me purpose and direction. You gave me a reason to put down roots and build something lasting. We saved each other, Angeline. That's what love does. It saves us from ourselves, from our loneliness, from the belief that we have to face the world alone." As the last light faded from the sky and the ranch settled into nighttime quiet, Carter and Angeline remained on the porch, neither willing to break the peaceful spell of the moment. They had built a good life from the ashes of a bad situation, raised children who were happy and healthy, and created a legacy that would last for generations. The girl who had been traded for whiskey had become a woman of substance and strength, a matriarch beloved by her family and respected by her community. And the cowboy who had poured out those bottles had become a man of integrity and honor, a husband and father who lived his values every single day. Their story wasn't just about a dramatic gesture in a saloon, though that moment would always be significant. It was about all the small choices that followed, the daily decisions to choose love over convenience, partnership over independence, forgiveness over grudges, and hope over fear. It was about building a life one day at a time, one conversation, one compromise, one act of kindness, until the accumulation of those moments created something strong and beautiful and lasting. When they finally rose from their seats and walked hand in hand into the cottage, Angeline paused in the doorway to look back at the mountains one more time. Somewhere out there in the darkness was Telluride, the town where her old life had ended and her new life had begun. Somewhere in that town was the Red Mountain Saloon, where a desperate father had traded his daughter for whiskey, and a courageous cowboy had poured it out while declaring her worth more than gold. "Thank you," she said softly, though she wasn't entirely sure who she was thanking. Carter, certainly, for his courage and love. Her younger self, perhaps, for being brave enough to accept his help and take a chance on something better. God, maybe, for bringing them together against all odds. Or possibly just the universe itself, for creating circumstances that allowed two broken people to find each other and become whole. Carter kissed her forehead, understanding without words, and together they went inside to the warm comfort of the home they had created, closing the door on the darkness and opening it to the light they had built together. One day at a time, one moment at a time, for 25 beautiful years. Their final years were spent in contentment, surrounded by the love of family and the satisfaction of a life well lived. When Carter passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72, Angeline grieved deeply, but without regret. They had been given more than 40 years together, decades of love and partnership that many people never experienced. She wore his mother's necklace every day until her own death 5 years later, and when she was buried beside him in the small cemetery overlooking the ranch, their children made sure the inscription on their shared headstone reflected the truth of their love. She was traded for whiskey. He poured it out and said she was worth more than gold. Together, they built a legacy of love. And in the years that followed, as their children and great-grandchildren worked the land they had pioneered. The story was told and retold, a reminder that love could bloom in the darkest circumstances, that courage could change the course of a life, and that sometimes the most valuable things in the world were the ones that couldn't be bought or sold or traded, but only freely given from one heart to another.